To the Talent Development Hot Seat. I am your host, Andy Storch, and I've got another great episode for you today to help you take your career and life in talent development to the next level. That is what this show is all about. That's our mission. Always looking for ways to find advice or provide advice and inspiration and education on different topics in the talent development world, the learning and development world. And today we're talking about learning culture and reinventing learning culture, as well as the idea of cohort-based learning and some of the systems that go along with that. My guest today is Andrew Barry. He is the founder of Curious Lion, a training design firm reimagining the way companies like PagerDuty, Pinterest, and KPMG cultivate learning cultures. He is the creator of Courses, a Course of Action, a self-paced program and community for aspiring course creators, and working towards making Andrew's vision that everyone has an online course in them a reality. I have an online course, and I know a lot of people, whether they do it as entrepreneurs or in companies, are thinking about creating online courses. And of course, a lot of big companies have been working on online learning, e-learning, virtual learning over the last few years. We're definitely going to talk about that. And his corporate experience, Andrew was head of learning at Lobster Ink, a video-based training provider in hospitality, later acquired by Ecolab. And he was also in charge of content for KPMG's executive education business before entering the world of startups and entrepreneurship. I know Andrew is originally from South Africa, but now resides here in the US in lovely New Jersey. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Andy, it is so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is an exciting day. We just did an interview for your podcast, and now we're turning the tables and doing an interview for the Talent Development Hot Seat. And in true entrepreneurish fashion, we're kind of like making things up as we go. And we just did a pivot, actually recording this one live on LinkedIn. So we'll see if anybody joins us. And if you are watching live, go ahead and put in the chat where you're joining from and let us know if you have any questions. But Andrew, I'll start with a question for you, which is, you had a corporate career in the learning space, right? How did you get into doing what you're doing now? Like, why go run your own business and follow this like path of learning culture and online courses and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so it is a series of pivots, which I know you talk a lot about, that happened part luck, part sort of setting the ball in motion for it, but just really being open and ready for opportunities. So if I had to summarize it, I started my career at KPMG as in public accounting. That was how I started there. But I immediately got a taste for public accounting firms. All do a lot of training, right? A huge investment in it. And every event that I would go to would be week-long training events. I just wanted to be the people up in front of the room facilitating those sessions. And so that's where I got my start. I started doing that. I taught high school maths, and so it kind of was always in me. But I just got a thrill from getting up in front of people and helping them see the light bulb go off in their heads, And so I followed that path with KPMG, an incredible firm to do that at, because I got to deliver training in South Africa. I got an opportunity to come here to the States to create the content for that. And just followed that journey all the way through to the executive education stuff you mentioned. But I always had this want of ownership of, you talk about this a lot, kind of wanting to kind of take agency for my career and run my own thing. And so that was always the back of my mind. About 5 years ago, I took the plunge into it. And for anybody listening, it never works out quite like you expect it to. I thought we would be doing high quality video production for banks, essentially. That was the big idea. And I've never created a video for a bank. We created quite a lot of videos, but for other companies. And then we started getting into tech companies, and it just, one of the things I learned is the market kind of tells you what they need. And it was just me at the beginning, able to adapt and pivot to those changing needs, and eventually carved a way out where we are now, where our business focuses on helping companies create systems for learning to get the most out of their investments in tech and content and all that. We also create content to help seed those systems. And then, like you said, I work with entrepreneurs as well to help them turn their knowledge into courses.
Yeah. And I know you work with a lot of different companies on this idea, as you mentioned, like kind of reinventing the way they're approaching, especially online learning. What are you observing in terms of how learning culture, how companies are approaching this idea of creating a learning culture, especially I'm sure things have changed a lot in the last 2 years since COVID. I've spoken with many, many, many talent development professionals on this show and in private conversations. What are you seeing right now that say that what some of the best companies are doing to create a true learning culture?
Yeah. Well, first, I think it first of all starts with an understanding and a shift away from seeing training as a series of events,
Mm,
right? Which has kind of been the norm always. Like that's very traditional way of looking at training. So, I mean, that was what I used to create as well. So, and everybody knows this. You do a bunch of needs analysis. You create a training event, and it could be some e-learning. It's often some in-person stuff, classroom setting. Um, and then you think the job's kind of done. Maybe you do some assessment at the end, and okay, cool, we saw we're basically just measuring completion, and that was it, right? That was training, and so a whole series of those, and that's a year of training for people. And I think we all can agree now that that doesn't really work. It's no one really learns like that. No one learns from instruction. They learn from on the job. They learn from talking to people. They learn from mentors and coaches, and they learn from. I know you talk about this a lot. Reflection, kind of taking the time and giving themselves space to reflect on what they're learning, and so it starts with kind of seeing learning and working as the same thing. If you add reflection to the work you're doing, you learning. That's deliberate practice, basically, which is one of the big accelerators for mastery. And so that's the shift. And so then it becomes, well, how do we create the system for learning? How do we create the space and the place for people to get together to talk about their challenges with a common lens, and I can explain what that means as well, so that they can start to help each other, guide each other, commit to take some kind of action, which is crucial, and then repeat that process over and over again.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you're seeing. Obviously, there's a lot of companies taking very different approaches, and I know you specialize in these online courses and virtual learning programs. And before COVID, certainly, like for many years, there's been online courses and online learning, right? But a lot of
Mm.
companies were forced into creating these online courses, right? And taking learning programs that were historically in person and making them virtual
Yeah.
again. Um, and many of them are using this idea of cohort-based learning, which I know you're an expert in as well. But maybe let's start with the online learning, the virtual learning. As companies are adapting these programs and creating these new programs and trying to create this culture of learning that we're talking about, what are some of the big mistakes that you see companies making? We'll start with the worst practices before we go to the best.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good starting point, because the easy way out is to take what worked in a classroom and just transfer it into an online setting. And the old MOOCs and all that are great examples of this. So we're just going to put a camera on the expert, and we're going to let them talk, and then there can be some interaction, but it's generally very superficial. But that's essentially it. So it's just, all right, we're just going to put this expert who stood up in front of the room, we're going to put a camera on them. And it's the easy way out, but of course it doesn't work. The other way, if you want to even lower the budget, is to just put all that stuff into basically an ebook, and just have people click slides. It's a slide deck that they get to control, and then people go, well, that's adaptive learning, because you get to control the pace of it or whatever. But yeah, none of that stuff works, right? How we actually learn in the workplace, and everyone who's worked in a corporate setting will agree, is we learn from taking action, doing something, and then seeing what went well, what didn't go well, and kind of reflecting on that, talking to others about it, reaching out to people, saying, hey, like someone who's more experienced than you in something, boss or supervisor, manager, getting advice on things. But there's a bias for action. There's a community aspect to it. And then there's a personal reflection piece. So
Hmm.
I talk about it as the 3 Ps often. So it's prompts to action, peer-to-peer learning, and the personal reflection. Right? Those to me are like the 3 key components for learning. So we can start to talk about, I can give you some specific examples of how we started to apply that. But this is, the origin story of a lot of this, Andy, is that I was talking to one of my clients probably around 2019, so it was before the pandemic hit. And I was telling her and just basically raving to her about these online courses that I was attending myself. I'm a total learning nerd. I spend an excessive amount of money every year on online courses. And there's some incredible ones out there, and I've learned so much from doing them.
Yeah.
And then I started in this sort of B2C side. I started dissecting what they were doing from an adult learning perspective and sort of geeking out on that side of it, sharing thoughts on that, and that attracted other entrepreneurs who wanted to learn how to do that. And then I started talking to, I never thought it would be interesting to the corporate world, but I started talking to Felicia Jones. She works at PagerDuty, and just like sharing this with her, and I was like, this is how it's helped me and all that sort of thing. And she saw the potential for it right away at PagerDuty. And this, again, was pre-COVID, and we started working on the idea. Back then, I used to call it the learning flywheel, because it really does work like a flywheel. Once you get people together and kind of taking these actions that I talked about around, learning from each other, taking action and reflecting, it takes a while to get it going, but that flywheel starts to generate its own momentum, and so to develop the idea from the flywheel into what this cohort learning experience looks like, and then the broader idea of the learning culture or learning system around it. But it all started with us. I think it was probably then at the beginning of the pandemic, because it was virtual, and I don't think they were going fully virtual at that point. So they had to, and so she said, well, let's pilot this with I have this executive development program I need to create. We're going to bring together a pilot group of 6 EVPs, right? So this was like the head of finance, the head of legal, the head of HR, the head of product, like functional heads. And we needed to teach them 3 skills, she told me. So they had picked, I think it was feedback, it was performance management, performance conversations. I forget what the last one was. And so we said, well, let's build this model around those 3 things for this group of 6 people. And so what it practically looked like was 6 weeks. We had 2 weeks per topic. So say like the performance management topic, we've had 2 weeks. Each week the first week was always talking through. So actually before the first week, they had async. So we created content for them, but it was, I know you're a big fan of Carol Dweck. So growth mindset stuff was a great example. We curated content. We also developed some original stuff as well, but we were able to curate so much great stuff out there. I mean, go and look at Carol Dweck's TED Talk. You're going to get a deep understanding of her stuff, right? And it's stuff that like we do as sort of lifelong learners normally. So we're like, well, how do we seed that for this group of people? So we curated a bunch of stuff for the performance management thing. Growth mindset was one of them. And so those models and mental models and frameworks gave people a common language. We weren't trying to get them to like memorize what the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset is, right? We were sharing that, and then to create this common language. Then they would come into a 60, I think it was a 90-minute session was the first one, and they would just talk about their actual challenges. So what we saw with people would be like, I got this guy on my team, and he's a really high performer, but he just seems to lack motivation. But get into a lot of detail, and they would. So now because of this shared understanding of growth mindset, fixed mindset in this example, someone else could be like, oh, I had that exact same thing, and here's what I did, and this is how it worked, and this is what worked, this didn't. And so the facilitation became so background, which is kind of what you want, right? All the learning started, all the magic happened amongst that group of people that leave that week 1 session committed to take some kind of new action. So that person was going to go and have a performance conversation with that individual. And then in the second week, it was a 60-minute session to debrief the actions, right? So first session is like discuss the mental models and the current challenges, commit to take action, and then come and debrief those actions. That session would always go longer than an hour, and the facilitators would hardly ever have to speak. It was just the people in there would just take over, and they had so much to share and so much. They were just learning, right? They were learning out loud. They were just learning with each other, and so we created a Slack channel for that group, and so they had a place to kind of keep the conversation going between these sessions, and we ran them for 6 weeks, 3 topics, and you could not. I mean, these were very busy, very just people that would not have had time for traditional training, they could not wait for the next one to start. And so PJ just kind of kept rolling these out, and that was how we got our starts, and we just kind of developed the model since then.
Yeah, that's a big marker of success to go from. I do not want to do that. Like, why do I have to do this boring training? Like most people approach it like, oh, I have to do this, versus like, I can't wait for that next session. And I think it sounds like sort of a requirement here is that it needs to be live, right? Facilitator led. We're not talking about pre-recorded, self-paced. There's a whole nother thing we could go into about what makes those good.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is the traditional flipped classroom in a way, because there's like some pre-recorded stuff just to basically give people that language, that common language, right? Introduce some frameworks, some models. It could the custom stuff we were doing would be, like how the company's values apply to these different topics. What is Teji or Pinterest's take on a certain topic? But yeah, that becomes. I just don't recommend clients ever invest a ton in that, because all that needs to do is just get the job done, right? Just get people thinking about these ideas. All the magic happens in those live sessions.
It really it happens in conversations, right? I see that with my own facilitation and learning. I've created a training program for my book, and I have an online course. People could go through it self-paced. It's a little bit more engaging than maybe reading the book. You get to watch videos of me. It sounds great. There's a workbook. But the magic happens, as I've seen it for 10 years of facilitating workshops. When you get people together, you create those breakout rooms, people have conversations, they get to really talk about their careers or whatever the learning is, right? Mindset, and get feedback and hear what others are dealing with and have those like aha light bulb moments.
Exactly. And you don't know where it goes, right? It takes on a life of its own after that. And then people don't see it as training anymore.
Right. And then the connections that are made too. You and I, when we were on your podcast talking about the importance of networking, there's so much magic that happens. You end up in that breakout room with somebody who ends up being your manager or business partner or something 5 years later.
Exactly. Mentor. There's actually, I want to unpack that a bit, because there are actually a ton of side effects, side benefits to this. That's a great one. And it creates this cohesion within the company. There's cross-functional sharing, right? Like right off the bat, because we recommend that's how you set these up. It's an incredible platform for people to air their challenges. So you're picking up, the voice of the people, basically, which is invaluable to any company. It's a great driver for DE&I, because instead of going back to your point, like you're not creating training that's like teaching people unconscious bias. You're not telling them this. You're showing it by bringing people together with diverse opinions. People feel this willingness or this desire to want to include others. They learn from others with these. So you're experiencing diversity and inclusion as opposed to hearing about it or watching it. So it promotes innovation, because people come up with ideas in these breakouts. Like just if you get the conditions right, it's incredibly generative. People's capacity to create increases.
Yeah, I believe it. There's just so much magic that happens. You mentioned earlier in there about cohort-based learning, and I mentioned that when we kicked things off too. How do you define cohort-based learning? What is it, and what are the benefits?
Yeah, so I forget now if we talked about this now or earlier when you and I were recording it separately, but it's collaborative learning is kind of at the key to it, right? So in the cohort piece, it is also a group that sort of tends to stick together around a topic or around a certain journey of learning. So that's how I kind of think of it. The collaborative piece is thinking very intentionally about, I love that you brought up breakouts, because that live session, like how you use it is so key. No one, there's nothing worse than going into a live session. You got everyone's camera off, everyone's on mute. It's just one person talking. It's a slide deck, and that's because it's easier. That's what most people have. But if you're really thoughtful and intentional about that, you can introduce the breakouts, the interaction, all of that in a non-cringy, non-uncomfortable way for people. And that's where the collaborative stuff comes in. That's when you put people in thoughtful pairings or groups, and all that sort of stuff. So that's one piece of it. And then the cohort thing is that repeat that over a period of time, right? I mean, I know you definitely would have this, and a lot of people listening, that you've got like your group, your tribe, your people that you hang out with, and learning something together is an incredibly powerful way to bond. And so we saw that at that PagerDuty one, and all the ones since then, is that those people kind of stuck together because they understood each other's challenges. They had helped each other out in certain things, and so that willingness or that tendency to want to stay together and kind of keep learning from each other is naturally there.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I mean, I always learn better when I'm with other people and can talk with them about it, and see that in my own programs, and others that I'm seeing out there. Um, so we talked about like this idea of cohort-based learning and the connections that people make in there, and the best practices for virtual learning. When you're looking at maybe some existing content or learning that's out there, how do you assess content to make sure it's engaging?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I always, because I'm thinking back now to my team. Like we meet every week, and often, and these are the kind of questions, like my team of learning architects. So that will be a question that they've posed to me, and I'm trying to remember kind of how I approach this. To me, I think where it all starts is figuring out in any piece of content or topic, or sort of category of ideas, what are the three big messages? Limiting yourself to that. So first of all, I'm a big believer in constraints being an enabler or promoter of creativity. Like if you're forced to kind of work within constraints, you often can be a lot more creative. And so I say to them all, like, what are the three key things? What are the three messages? The other benefit of having those three key things up there, up front all the time is, and I tell them, like, put it on a sticky note and stick it on your computer as you're working on that piece of content. You've always got your North Stars of where you need to. So everything you put on the page, if it's a video script or anything you design into a facilitation guide, you ask yourself, does it meet one of those three things? Right. So that to me is super key. You've got those sort of three key messages, because that's also, I mean, it goes into a lot of the how we learn stuff. People's working memory can only hold 3 to 5 things at any given time. So you're really trying to limit the number of key messages. You know what? If your subject matter experts out there tell you you've got 10 things that you need to stuff in there, okay, cool. Well, here's 3, the main ones, and then here's where to go and find everything else. Right? You can always point people in the right direction, but don't try and cram it all in. And then I guess once you've got that, so there's there's a less is more sort of approach, ruthlessly cutting stuff. Once you've got that, you've got the kind of the building blocks to work with, and then I just look at, well, this is going to sound very like passe, but what is the learning experience? What's the learner experience? And I get very like, we'll spend an entire hour talking through one activity in a facilitation guide we're creating for people, because I'm asking questions like, what is the learner done before that session starts? So what frame of mind are they coming in with? What questions do they have when they start this? And often those questions we give them as prompts in workbooks. So then you understand kind of where they're coming into this. What do we want them to feel and think right away? So what's that like initial, do we want them to drop in the chat where they come from, and like you did earlier, right? So you're thinking like in micro moments what that learner experience is like. How do we set them up for the breakouts? Are they going to be confused with the question or the prompt, or they're going to know what to do? Like, so we spend a lot of time thinking about that, because I think that's where all the leverage is, right? If you can create that experience where people join a session, like another thing, I always play music at the beginning of it. Creates a bit of a vibe and a scene. And I also try and recognize some folks that like names that I recognize, and I'll call them out and just, create like a welcoming atmosphere. So little things like that leave people feeling like they've been in an experience, right? Like they've been to a concert, like they've been to like a show, like something that they enjoyed, and they don't feel like it was learning,
Right. Yeah. You're making things interactive. You're engaging with people, trying to turn that energy up, and you're coming into the whole thing with a plan, right? To take things back to at the beginning of this conversation, you were talking about the learning flywheel and the 3 Ps, bringing that back into it, right? And how are we engaging people, and
exactly.
the prompts. Can we go back to that so that the prompts?
Yeah.
What is it again?
So like, yeah. So that's a great point, because at every time I'm thinking, how are we getting them to reflect? A personal reflection.
Mm-hmm.
How are we prompting action? So recommended next steps, or what are you going to do next? The type of things. And then the peer-to-peer learning. How are we getting them to discuss? I don't even like to use the word discuss. To me, dialogue is much better, because discuss is like, to me, this back and forth lobbying of ideas. Dialogue is really like understanding what the other person's saying, and there's nuance to it. And so, yeah, so are we hitting those things? Are people reflecting? The personal reflection? Is there a prompt action, and are they peer-to-peer learning?
Yeah. Okay. And then you talk about the flywheel, which is like learning, action, and reflection. And people forget about this stuff, right? Like learning, if there's no reinforcement or reflection on it, a lot of times we just do it and then we move on to the next thing and we forget.
That's the thing, right? We're all guilty. I'm definitely guilty of that. Here's a perfect example. I know you're a big book guy. I am too. I've got a bunch here. There's a bunch behind me. It was only recently that I started actively taking notes on books and then using that in creating new things. Right? I'd read. We talk about this on my show. Like, first of all, you go from not having a good reading habit, and you read like 2 books a year, to getting a good reading habit. Like you said, 20 minutes every morning, and now you're reading 25 books a year. Okay, cool. That's great. That's like step 1. Then what I started to become was more intentional about taking notes, like capturing ideas from things, so that I could remix them and repurpose them later, and then actually turning them into something and creating new stuff. And so that's one example of it. It's doing something with all the consumption that you're already doing.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense, and I'm glad you're putting that stuff out there, because I think these are things that a lot of people kind of know in the learning space, but it's like, okay, are you doing these things? Are you reinforcing? Are you giving people opportunities for dialogue, not just discussion, right? And really giving them opportunities to truly learn.
It feels like back to basics. Sometimes when I'm putting stuff out there, I'm saying stuff that's so obvious for people here, but it does seem to resonate in that it's a reminder that sometimes the basic approach of bringing people together to learn from each other is the most powerful approach. And that all the I think we've gotten all that learning tech and all that stuff that's out there is incredibly important, but we've gotten too blindsided by it, distracted by it, and it's sort of taken us away from how we actually learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got to wrap this up, Andrew, but I want to find out, what are you working on now? I know you have your own cohort based learning program, Cohort, starting soon for L&D professionals that could be really beneficial to helping them do the things that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun. So we're launching the first one in June. We plan to run 2 a year, and the goal with that is to bring learning professionals together to help them build systems for learning. And so the whole thing is going to be a 5-week cohort-based learning experience where you will build a cohort learning experience. So it's going to be very meta. I want to give people that experience so that they know what good looks like, and then they will leave the program with a cohort learning experience they can roll out at their companies. And so that sort of, to me, is like, that's where I'd love people to end up. For folks who are interested in this idea, one is trying to see it being built, and as I learn in public, which I know is something you enjoy doing as well. I've got 2 other things that folks should definitely check out. And it's a podcast and a newsletter that I write. And so you can get all of these things if you go to curiouslion.cloud and you go /letter, take you to the newsletter, /podcast, or /experience. It'll take you to those 3 things. Yeah, and I really encourage folks to join the newsletter and the podcast and kind of follow this journey, because I know that I don't know everything about this topic, and it's going to be, we've got this amazing founding council, Kristen Hartley, who is the person who introduced us, is part of it. It's the community that's going to form around this that's going to help shape what this is, that this specific idea around cohort learning, learning culture, learning systems. So if anybody's interested in that, definitely let me know. Yeah, curiouslion.cloud, and then just go to /letter or /podcast or /experience.
Yeah, and I remember we talked about this before, so I want to make sure people know about the discount that you offered for my audience as well. If you go to curiouslion.cloud/experience, and if you do decide to sign up for this experience, I think we have a discount in there, right? For if you put in Think Tank,
Yep.
THINKTANK for 10% off.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, I think of that as a scholarship for people that are in your network and in your communities who, to me, those are the people out there that are driving this whole thing forward. And so I want people like that in the community. I'll share one last story with you if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Why that's so important, because I ran a cohort-based course for 150 people this time last year, actually. And it was, first of all, it was the most stressful thing I've ever done. It was 8 weeks, nearly killed me because
Yeah.
it is so crazy. And 150 people, I wouldn't recommend starting with.
Right.
But what I realized from that is the community makes it. It makes or breaks the whole experience. And I spent the whole of the beginning of that year interviewing every single person that applied and handpicking those 150 people. And I'm
Mm.
so glad I did, because that's ultimately what it is. And it became way bigger than me. Um, and it is that meta thing. It's like the content and the stuff that I was sharing in the live sessions is a small part of it, but all the conversations and interactions outside of it is where all the learning happens, right? Or 80% of it, like Pareto principle. So that's really why I'm looking to partner with people like you who have that community and those people following them.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, we're putting it out there. It sounds like a cool opportunity. So curiouslion.cloud/experience and use the code Think Tank for 10% off. And Andrew, I appreciate all the education you provided and the work that you've been putting in to learn all these things and educate others. So thank you again for coming on. Hang in there because we're going to do a little bonus round for our next episode. But thanks so much for being on today.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. So if you're watching live, don't leave us. We are going to do a little bonus round here. We're going to split into a second episode. You get to see a little bit behind the curtain. We're going to do a bonus round Q&A here. Are you ready, Andrew?
I was not expecting this. I'm so ready.
All right. I haven't done this live before. This is fun. All right, here we go. Welcome back to the Talent Development Hot Seat. I am your host, Andy Storch, and I'm excited to have Andrew Barry back on for a little bonus round Q&A. Andrew, thinking back on your own career, what's been your proudest moment or biggest accomplishment so far?
I gotta say the birth of my son 2 years ago, almost to the day, two weeks after that. Yeah, I mean that was something that I don't think I ever could have realized, like the full enormity of, and it was preceded by a lot of big moments. But yeah, that has by far been the most life-changing, proudest moments. But to keep it about careers, I think to me it's definitely, I mean, it's starting my company, because it was the hardest thing. It took a year and a half to get going, but I learned so much in that year and a half. And so I don't think you're ever ready to start these things, and I'm glad I just did when I did, even though I was woefully unprepared and definitely wasn't ready. But it was the best way to get started, because I learned quickly, and kept building up. So I think we've had a lot of success since then, but I'm definitely proudest of just starting.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you on that. Very proud of the birth of both of my children, and also proud of starting my business and keeping it going and building it to what it is. And I know you feel the same way.
Yeah.
Flip side of that, Andrew, what has been one of your biggest failures or mistakes in your career, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah. So I started another company at one point. It's called LeadStream. It was to help people generate leads for their business, B2B leads. And it was something that I developed because I built a system for my own business to develop a bunch of leads through that. And I was like, oh, this could be useful for others. I was productized it. And I think the mistake, and spoiler alert, it didn't work out, and I've shut that business down. But
Yeah.
I also wasted a lot of time doing that, because it split my focus from the stuff that I didn't like. I didn't enjoy it as much, right? And it clearly wasn't as successful. But it split my attention from the stuff I really enjoy doing. So that's probably the biggest regret, is that I I got like shiny object syndrome. I thought, oh, could be a nice automated way to make money, and spend a bit too much time like pursuing that. But finally cut it loose.
Yeah. So what was the big lesson there? I mean, first of all, one thing I take away from that is lessons I've learned, because I've tried a lot of these, like, oh, if I just do this one thing, then I'll be on autopilot and making money easily the rest of my life.
Yeah.
But like, that whole there's no free lunch and there's no like easy way out. Like you got to put in the work. But any other lessons that came from that?
Ruthless focus on the one thing, the vision, the purpose, stuff that you've talked about. But yeah, ruthless focus to me is so key. We all time poor. We all have to be very guarded about where we spend our time and where we devote our attention. And I was doing a poor job, in two things instead of a really good job at one thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been there. And we are recording this live right now. If you are joining us, do you have any questions, let us know. With some great comments in the chat for Jeff Fryer and Holly Phillips. Thank you so much for joining us. Andrew, what would you say is the biggest trend that you're following in the talent development world right now? Most exciting?
Yeah, geez, there's so many, right? I think some of the ones that come to mind is the consolidation that's happening in the LXP space. And so I'm very, very interested in the work we do with our clients is how do you get the most building the systems and culture around the tech you've invested in. So I'm really interested to see what happens with those consolidations and specifically really the difference between consolidation, like we saw with Cornerstone buying Edcast, versus decentralized strategic partnerships where and like the most recent one I can think of is Degreed and Filtered, who had that alliance or that partnership, and I think that's the way to go. I think there's a lot to be said for people focusing on the thing they're really, really good at, and developing strong partnerships with complementary services, and I think that's going to help L&D professionals a lot more than consolidation, which sort of forces you into making decisions on things that you should really have agency over yourself.
Yeah, makes sense. Is there a book or a TED Talk that you often recommend or has made a big impact for you in your career?
Yeah, I was just trying to find it around me here, but it's not. It must be somewhere else where I've been taking notes. Something I've revisited this book so many times, but it's The Fifth Discipline by Peter Sankey. I've read that book over and over again. I'd say I've spent 2 or 3 years with that book. It's one I've gone back to the most, and I actually posted a summary of it. It's a 5,000 word or 6,000 word summary of it on my blog this year. And yeah, it's this idea of returning to recognizing that we are not separate from the world. We are actually connected. We're one with the world, and how that applies to an organization that is a learning organization. So it's like, I can't even add words to that. It's something that I highly recommend anybody who cares about how people learn and how to make workplaces better learning places for people.
Yeah. Okay. Fifth Discipline by Peter Sankey. And if you don't have time to read the whole book, it sounds like Andrew has a 5,000 word summary on his blog. Is that at curiouslion.cloud on the blog there?
Yep. I think / The Fifth Discipline. It's one of the most recent posts. So yeah, go check curiouslionlearning.com.
All right, let's see if we can find that and put a link in our show notes for the podcast. Yeah. And last question for you, Andrew. When we were on your podcast, we talked all about career development, how people own their careers. When you think about careers, especially for people in learning and development who are looking for ways to find more success in their careers, what's one more piece of advice you would give?
I'm going to struggle not to use something that you've talked about because I think you and I think quite similarly on things.
That's okay. You're allowed to.
Yeah, I think honestly, I think the one that you mentioned as well, but which really has changed the trajectory of my career in the last 1 to 2 years is the concept of personal brand and how important it is. So you talk about it as, which I think is a great framing, is how people think of you or talk about you when you're not in the room. Right. And so in my business, that's incredibly important. In you and I, like that's incredibly important. But even if you're working in a job, it's it's what people are talking about when they're discussing promotions, when they're discussing compensation, and all that kind of stuff. And so that to me is so key. And I think it tracks back to what we said earlier about, I think a starting point for personal branding is building networks, which you talk about, and then turning consumption into creation. And so the thing, we talked about this on my show, but for anybody listening to this one, a great starting point, if you feel like you don't have original ideas, you don't have ways to start conversations, because you should always definitely join other people's conversations. That's a great way to get started. But when you are ready to bridge the sort of gap to start them, is start curating, like my summary of the fifth discipline. Summarize other people's work. You are doing others a huge service.
Mm-hmm.
You're demonstrating how you think, and you are bringing people together. You're connecting others, people who wrote those original pieces to someone's podcast that you listen to. That is an incredibly valuable service. And I see a few people doing that on LinkedIn, and I think I encourage a lot more people to do that. Just be a curator.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we just talked about it a couple minutes ago. You summarized the book, fit this in a blog, and 5,000 words sounds like a long blog, but the book's probably 60,000 words. So it's a lot shorter than that. Plus, you throw in your own insights. Other people can benefit from that. We've talked about that, you and I, before. You don't have to create your own original content on social media. Just sharing what you are reading and learning, articles, books, podcasts. You're listening to this podcast, or you've read my book, or gone through some of your blog or content. Share that on social media. Like, hey, I just read this book, and here's 3 things that I got from it. People can benefit from that. They appreciate that. And it builds your brand as someone who is learning, who is curious, who is interested, right? Who is like staying on top of the latest trends and things like that. So,
and over time, you develop your own voice. You'll start to like it. And trust me, this happened to me, because I was a terrible writer 2 years ago. I couldn't think of one original thing. And now it comes a lot more naturally, because it's repetition. It's at bats, and you get better and better at it, and you start to see connections and things, and you're like, oh, that's actually figure out what you find interesting, because I guarantee you others will as well.
Yeah, and that could turn into, who knows, a blog, a podcast, a book.
Totally.
Maybe it doesn't have to be original ideas. It could be your spin on the things that you've read and learned. If anybody out there's read my book, Own Your Career, Own Your Life, it's my spin on all the things that I've done and learned, but I credit all the other books that I've read along the way and people I've learned from. Yeah. So, Andrew, this has been great. I've learned a lot from you. I appreciate you taking the time to be on here. Everybody who's joined us live and who's been listening on recording, thanks so much for listening. Again, your website, curiouslion.cloud, our website, talentdevelopmenthotseat.com, and we look forward to talking to you more in the future.
Dude, I love talking to you. This has been so much fun, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.